6 brothers, alone, freezing on a train platform in the middle of a Wyoming nowhere. The townsfolk saw them as a problem, a burden. 6 more mouths to feed in a town that was already starving for hope. They wanted them gone. But the mountain man who found them saw something different. He was a giant of a man named Bear, and he saw a secret in the oldest boy's eyes. A secret that would either save the town of Cedar Falls or burn it to the ground. He thought he was just coming to town for supplies. He had no idea he was walking straight into a reckoning. They called him Bear, Samuel Bear Thompson. Not just for his size, which was considerable, but for the quiet he carried around him. A silence as deep and cold as the mountain winters he'd lived in for 15 years. He was a man who had built a wall of solitude around a wound he never spoke of. Cedar Falls was a town clinging to the edge of a map, a place the railroad had built and was now threatening to forget. The good times had dried up, leaving behind a hard crust of desperation. People's faces were tight, their eyes wary. Bear felt the town's mood the moment he led his horse down the main street. It was a place holding its breath, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. He had no idea it was already there, huddled on the train platform. He saw them through the fog, 6 small shapes clustered together under a ripped piece of canvas. At first he thought they were just drifters, but they were too small, too still. He tied his horse and walked toward them. The wooden planks of the platform groaned under his weight. As he got closer, the oldest boy stood up. He couldn't have been more than 14, but his eyes were ancient. He placed himself in front of the others, a scarecrow of a boy ready to fight a giant. "We ain't causing trouble, mister," the boy said, his voice a raw whisper. "Just waiting on our pa." Bear knelt down, a slow, deliberate movement to show he meant no harm. Even on one knee, he was a mountain in front of them. "What's your name, son?" His voice was a low rumble, gentle as a distant storm. "Timothy Walsh." The boy's chin was high, his pride the only thing holding him together. "These are my brothers, Michael, Joseph, Peter, Davids, and Matthew." He pointed to each one. A roll call of the forgotten. Bear's eyes took in the scene, the hollow cheeks, the patched-together clothes, the way the 4-year-old Matthew was wrapped in what looked like his older brother's shirts, leaving their own arms bare to the biting cold. They were starving, but they were a unit, a pack. They had a system. They were survivors. "How long you been here?" Bear asked. 3 days, Timothy said. "Pa went to Denver to find work. He's coming back." Bear's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, cracked. He'd heard this story before. A father's promise on a train platform was often just a ghost, an echo that faded with the whistle of the departing train. These boys hadn't just been left behind. They'd been abandoned. But it was worse than that. So much worse. He bought them bread and milk from the general store. The owner, a stern widow named Agnes Murphy, watched with sharp eyes as the boys devoured the food, their hunger a raw, desperate thing. Then the door swung open, and Ezra Caldwell walked in. Caldwell was the town council chairman, a man who saw rules and regulations where other people saw human beings. "Thompson!" he snapped, his eyes like chips of ice. "I hear you're collecting strays. This town is not a charity ward. We can't afford to take on every vagrant's cast-offs." Before Bear could answer, Timothy stood up, swaying on his feet. "We ain't vagrants," he said, his voice shaking with a fury that was too big for his small body. "And our pa ain't no drifter." Caldwell just laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "I've heard that story 100 times, boy. Your father is gone, and you are not our problem." The words were a physical blow. The boys flinched, their small faces closing down, the hope that had flickered just moments before being snuffed out. And that's when Bear knew. This was more than just a rescue. This was a fight. "They're not the town's problem, Ezra," Bear said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They're mine." But as he said it, he saw a look flash across Caldwell's face. It wasn't just annoyance, it was fear, a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. Why would a powerful man like Ezra Caldwell be afraid of 6 starving boys? Bear got the boys a room above the general store, a small, clean space that felt like a palace after the train platform. While they rested, he started asking questions. He learned that the boy's father, Patrick Walsh, hadn't just been a logger. He was a surveyor, a good one, and he'd been hired by the railroad to resurvey the timber claims in the hills around Cedar Falls, the same hills where Ezra Caldwell's logging company had been operating. A cold suspicion began to form in Bear's mind. He went to the school teacher, Sarah Martinez, a sharp young woman from the East. He asked her to test the boys, not just to see what they knew, but to see what their father might have taught them. The results were stunning. The boys weren't just literate, they were educated, especially Michael, the 12-year-old. He had a mind for numbers that was uncanny, and he had a perfect memory for maps. Their father was teaching them his trade, Sarah told Bear, her eyes wide with the implication. "Look at this. These are Michael's drawings. They're survey maps, and they don't match the official town records." That night, a rock crashed through the window of the boys' room. Wrapped around it was a note. "Leave, or you'll end up like your father." The threat was clear. Patrick Walsh hadn't just left. He'd been run off, or worse, and whoever had done it was still in Cedar Falls, and they were terrified of what those boys might know. The town was a powder keg, and Bear had just lit the fuse. The threat changed everything. The boys weren't just abandoned anymore. They were witnesses, and they were in danger. Bear Thompson, the man who had run from the world, now found himself standing between 6 children and a killer. He took the note to the sheriff, a man named Morrison who seemed more interested in keeping the peace than in finding justice. Morrison looked at the note, then at Bear, his expression weary. "Probably just some drunks, Bear," he said, crumpling the paper. "You bring these boys into town, you stir things up. Best thing for everyone is if they move on." "They're not moving on," Bear said, his voice flat. "And that wasn't a drunk. That was a warning." He knew he was alone in this. The law wasn't going to help him. The town was split. Some, like Agnes Murphy and the teacher Sarah Martinez, saw the boys for what they were: brave, resilient kids who deserved a chance. Others, led by Ezra Caldwell, saw them as a threat to the town's fragile stability. Caldwell's campaign against the boys became more aggressive. He used his position on the council to argue that the town's resources were too scarce. He whispered in the saloon that the boys were thieves, that their father was a criminal. He was trying to poison the well, to turn the whole town against them. But why? What was he so afraid of? The answer came from an unexpected place. The town doctor, a quiet, gentle man named Harrison, had been treating Michael for a persistent cough. During one visit, Michael, whose memory was a steel trap, mentioned something his father had said. "Pa told me the trees tell a story," Michael said to the doctor. "He said you can count their rings to know their age. He said Mr. Caldwell's men were cutting down the wrong trees, the old ones, the ones on the railroad's land." Dr. Harrison's blood ran cold. He went to Bear that night, his face pale in the lantern light. "It's not just about a few trees, Bear," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Patrick Walsh found proof that Caldwell has been illegally logging on federal land for years, stealing thousands of dollars worth of timber. Walsh was on his way to Denver to report him to the railroad authorities and the U.S. Marshals. Now it all made sense. Caldwell's fear, his desperation to get the boys out of town. He hadn't just threatened their father. He had every reason in the world to make sure Patrick Walsh never made it to Denver, and to make sure his sons never had a chance to tell what they knew. But before they could act on this new information, the sky opened up. The autumn storm that had been threatening for days hit with a savage fury. The creek, already swollen with early rain, became a raging monster. It tore through the lower part of town, a wall of churning muddy water that ripped buildings from their foundations. Cedar Falls wasn't just in economic trouble anymore. It was fighting for its life. The flood was a nightmare. Water surged through the main street, turning it into a river of debris. Houses were torn apart. The town was being washed away. Bear and the Walsh brothers were in the middle of it all. They weren't thinking about Ezra Caldwell or his dark secrets. They were thinking about survival. Timothy, with the instincts of a natural leader, organized his brothers. They helped Agnes Murphy get the last of her valuable stock to the second floor of the store. They were a team, working with a quiet efficiency that shamed many of the panicked adults. Then a cry for help cut through the roar of the water. The Hendersons, an elderly couple who lived in a small cabin near the creek, were trapped. Their cabin was being torn apart by the current. Without a second thought, Timothy and Michael grabbed a rope. "We can get to them," Timothy yelled to Bear over the storm. "We're strong swimmers. Pa taught us." It was a crazy risk. The water was a death trap. But looking at the Hendersons' collapsing cabin, Bear knew they were the old couple's only hope. He watched in a state of terrified awe as the two boys, tied together with a rope, fought their way through the raging current. They reached the cabin just as the porch gave way. They managed to get the old couple out a window and, with the help of Bear and the other men on the bank, pull them to safety. They were heroes. But their heroism came at a cost. Michael, battered by debris, was pulled from the water, hypothermic and barely conscious. As Dr. Harrison worked to save the boy's life, something else was happening. Peter, the 8-year-old with a knack for mechanics, had been staring at the wreckage of a small dam upstream that had given way, releasing the main torrent of water. "It wasn't just the rain," Peter said, his small voice almost lost in the chaos. He was pointing at a massive, splintered beam that had been part of the dam's main support. That beam, it was rotten. Someone used bad timber. Bear's eyes narrowed. He knew who had built that dam. Ezra Caldwell. Caldwell had used cheap, rotten wood to build the dam for his logging operation. He had cut corners to save money, and now the entire town was paying the price. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was attempted murder, but their ordeal was far from over. As the flood waters began to recede, a new threat arrived. A stranger on the westbound train. A man in a fancy suit who said he was from the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau. His name was Theodore Blackwood, and he was here to take the boys away. Theodore Blackwood was a man made of paper and ink. He saw the world in terms of regulations and procedures, and the Walsh brothers, in his eyes, were a procedural nightmare. 6 abandoned minors in the informal care of a mountain man. It was a violation of a dozen territorial statutes. "This arrangement is unacceptable," he told Bear, his voice crisp and final. "The boys will be taken into territorial custody and placed in the children's home in Cheyenne." Bear had heard of the home in Cheyenne. It was a place where children were given a number and a bed, and little else. A place where brothers would be separated, their spirits broken by the cold, impersonal machinery of bureaucracy. "You'll do that over my dead body," Bear said, his voice a low growl. The town, still reeling from the flood, was once again divided. Some, like Caldwell, saw Blackwood as a solution, a way to get rid of the boys and the problems they represented. Others, who had seen the boys' courage during the flood, were horrified. Agnes Murphy, her store in ruins, stood in the muddy street and faced down the government man. "Those boys did more for this town in one night than you've done in your entire life, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You will not take them." But Blackwood had the law on his side. He didn't care that Michael Walsh had nearly died saving a life. He didn't care that Peter Walsh had identified the cause of the disaster. All he cared about were his rules. He arranged to interview each boy to document their unsuitable living conditions. It was a formality. His mind was already made up. That's when the boys decided to fight back. Not with their fists, but with their words. That night, sitting by a single lantern in their small room, they each wrote a letter to the man who was about to tear their family apart. They told him about their mother, about their father's struggle, about the promises they had made to each other. They told him about Bear and how he had taught them what it meant to be a family again. And Timothy, the oldest, added one more thing, a secret. He told Blackwood about his father's last words to him on the train platform. "There's a ledger, son," his father had whispered, pressing their worn family Bible into his hands. "In the back. Don't let anyone see it. It's the only justice we'll ever get." Bear and the boys had looked. Tucked into a slit in the back cover of the Bible was a small, thin ledger book. It was filled with Patrick Walsh's survey notes, and it held the truth about Ezra Caldwell's crimes. The illegal logging, the stolen timber, all of it documented in Patrick's precise, steady hand. The next morning, Timothy handed the stack of letters to Mr. Blackwood. And at the bottom of the stack was the ledger. Blackwood read the letters, his face unreadable. Then he opened the ledger. He read for a long, silent hour. When he finally looked up, he was a different man. The bureaucratic certainty in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else. A flicker of doubt, a hint of shame. He had come to Cedar Falls to enforce the rules, but he had just been handed proof of a crime that was bigger than any regulation in his books, and he had been handed a story of a family's love and loyalty that was more powerful than any law. He was a man caught between two worlds, the world of paper and rules, and the world of mud and courage and the undeniable truth of the human heart. And his next move would decide the fate of them all. Theodore Blackwood was a man who had built his life on the solid foundation of rules, but Patrick Walsh's ledger was a tremor that shook that foundation to its core. He looked at Bear, then at the 6 boys standing behind him, a small, defiant clan. "This changes things," Blackwood said, his voice quiet. He wasn't a bureaucrat anymore. He was a witness. He didn't go to the sheriff. He knew the local law was in Caldwell's pocket. Instead, he went to the telegraph office. He sent a long coded message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Then he did something that wasn't in any of his rule books. He called a town meeting, not as a government official, but as a man who had a story to tell. He stood before the people of Cedar Falls, the survivors of the flood, and he read the boys' letters aloud. He read Timothy's words about leadership. He read Michael's words about wanting to help others. He read Matthew's simple, heartbreaking plea for a papa. When he was done, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then he held up the ledger. "This book," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "is the last will and testament of a man named Patrick Walsh. A man who was trying to protect this town from a thief. A man who was silenced because he knew the truth." He laid out Caldwell's crimes, the stolen timber, the faulty dam. The flood that had destroyed their homes wasn't an act of God. It was the result of one man's greed. Ezra Caldwell, sitting in the front row, his face a mask of outrage, stood up. "These are lies, the ravings of a dead drifter and his delinquent sons." "Are they?" Blackwood asked. "Then you won't mind if we have an independent surveyor check your timber claims against these notes, or if we have an engineer examine the wreckage of your dam." Caldwell's face went pale. He was trapped. And then, from the back of the room, a man stood up. It was Silas Morton, the cantankerous rancher who had first heckled the boys in the restaurant. "I was with Walsh the day before he left," Morton said, his voice rough. "He told me he was afraid. He said Caldwell had threatened him. I told him to keep his mouth shut. I told him it wasn't his fight." He looked at the Walsh brothers, his face full of a shame that was 10 years old. "I was wrong." That was it. The dam of silence broke. Other men came forward, loggers who had been ordered to cut the wrong trees, a store clerk who had seen Caldwell altering his books. The whole rotten conspiracy came tumbling down. The U.S. Marshals arrived the next day. They didn't come for the Walsh boys. They came for Ezra Caldwell. Justice, when it finally came to Cedar Falls, was swift and absolute. A week later, Judge Harrison Whitmore arrived from Cheyenne. The courthouse was packed, but this wasn't a criminal trial. It was an adoption hearing. The judge looked down from his bench at the giant mountain man and the 6 boys standing beside him. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Adopting 6 children at once is highly irregular." "Your Honor," Bear said, his voice steady, "there's nothing regular about this family. We found each other in a storm." The judge looked at the 6 boys, their faces clean, their clothes new, their eyes bright with a future they had never dared to imagine. "So I see," he said. He stamped his gavel. "Adoption granted." The courtroom exploded in cheers. Bear Thompson, the man who had hidden from the world, was now the father of 6 sons. The 6 abandoned boys finally had a home. Their story didn't end there. It was just the beginning. The Thompson boys, as they were now known, grew up to become the pillars of a new Cedar Falls, a town rebuilt not just with new timber, but with a new spirit, a spirit of compassion and community. Timothy became the mayor. Michael became an engineer who designed flood control systems that saved countless towns. Joseph built a business empire on the principle of fair wages. Peter became a master craftsman. David, an artist who captured the beauty of the Wyoming wilderness. And Matthew, the little boy who had just wanted a papa, he became a doctor. He dedicated his life to making sure no child ever suffered the way he and his brothers had. Bear lived to be an old man surrounded by sons and grandchildren. He had found his 6 boys on a train platform, lost and alone. But in the end, they were the ones who had rescued him. They had brought him down from his lonely mountain and taught him how to be a father. They say that if you visit Cedar Falls today, you can still see the old train platform. There's a bronze plaque there now. It doesn't talk about trains or schedules. It just says, "No child gets left behind." It had started as one man's promise to 6 desperate boys, but it became a town's promise to its own soul. If this story reminded you that family is something you build, not just something you're born into, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let us know in the comments. What do you think is the strongest bond in the world? Thanks for watching.